Okay, so we're continuing this week with the Middle Ages. We've been talking about the development of culture, sort of this resurgence of the classics, the political and economic developments of the Western world during the Middle Ages. Particularly, we just got finished talking about the peak of the Middle Ages and the High Middle Ages. And this was sort of the golden era of the Middle Ages. But now we're going to go on to crisis and disintegration in the Middle Ages. The reason we talk about this is I want you to pay attention as you go through your course materials for this week, because this is really important to the development. This time period is really important to the development of Western civilization and the subsequent eras that we're going to be talking about. The Protestant Reformation, the Renaissance, exploration, all of these things have their roots in this era, because what we see is that, this is a time period in which it is a really difficult time to be alive. There was tremendous loss of life, tremendous destabilization of society, lots of movement of populations that were able to survive some of these disasters, the 100 Years' War and the Black Plague. And in all of this upheaval and all of this crisis, what we see is changes in the way that people thought, changes in the way that people viewed authority. And as a result of some of these fundamental changes in the way that people thought and believed and saw the world, this is going to lead to a rebirth of European society. This is what Renaissance means. It means rebirth. And so it's going to lead people to think in new ways and view the world differently, to such an extent that people are incredibly innovative, and they reinvent society, and they reinvent culture, and they reinvent politics. It's really fascinating to see this development. And so as you're going through the materials, I want you to pay attention to what's going on in these societies and what sort of cues that you see that people are starting to think in new and different ways, that they're going to be led to challenge the status quo. Okay, so we're going to just kind of revisit some different areas that we've been talking about, but first we're going to talk about the church. We have in this time period that we're talking about, in the latter part of the Middle Ages, the Pope Innocent III, he was Pope during the 13th century, the very early part, and the latter part of the 12th century, the early part of the 13th century, so around the years 1198 to 1216. During this time, the church really sought to strengthen its institutions of law and justice, and to reorder the world in the image of heaven. Now, Pope Innocent III was really powerful, and he was well respected. He was actually trained at the University of Bologna in theology. Remember, the University of Bologna is an old university that continues to be respected today. And it was one of those premier institutions where Europeans went to get a really good education, and there was prestige that went along with that. One of his goals as a pope was to magnify papal authority. He wanted to build on papal authority and increase it and expand it. In 1215, he called a church council, which was called the Fourth Lateran Council, and the idea was to regulate church teaching and Christian life. Now, the council made teachings on the sacraments. These were rituals that conveyed grace. They sought to make these rituals more precise and detailed. They reinforced the importance of the Eucharist. If you remember, the Eucharist is that sort of reenactment of Jesus' Last Supper. And they also sought to reinforce the teaching that through transubstantiation, which involved sort of the host and the wine becoming Jesus' blood and body, this was a doctrine that the council was concerned with, sort of making orthodox doctrine. It was still kind of in flux, and there were still people who had differing ideas on what the Eucharist exactly meant. And so the council is striving to make transubstantiation, the idea that the wine and the bread became Jesus's blood and body. They're seeking to make this an orthodox idea and one that is widely accepted throughout Christianity. Now, the church claimed more authority over the sacrament of marriage, which is really interesting development because in the past, marriage was largely regulated by the community. It was not necessarily a church ritual. This council also claimed jurisdiction over marital disputes, and they wanted to strengthen the church's role in seeking out impediments to marriages. So the idea is that the church is going to have an integral role in how people are married, the conditions under which they marry. The impact of these teachings, especially on the Eucharist and annual confession, this idea that you went to the priest to confess at least once a year, the impact of these reforms was really considerable. And it's going to have an impact for quite some time. Now, the council also required Jews to make themselves known through outward signs, usually things like badges, clothing, or hats. And the rules were enforced variously on the local level. So you would have some variation in how those rules would be followed at the local level, whether they were enforced or not. The Fourth Lateran Council directed secular authorities to rid their lands of heretics. Rulers were threatened with excommunication and loss of land, and vassals if they failed to do so. So there were consequences. So what we see happening during this time in this part of the Middle Ages is that we kind of see a little bit of a hardening of the church's position on several things, and that included the sacraments and heresy. And that hardening of the position on heresy comes into play in the way that Jews are treated. Now, if you take a look at this piece of artwork, this is a beautiful piece, and it is Jewish artwork from the time period. And I want you to take a look at it and just study it a little bit and see what you think. You can see at the top some lettering. This would be Hebrew lettering. Now, what signs and symbols reveal this work to be of Jewish rather than Christian origin? Well, I already told you that some of this lettering is Hebrew, but what are some other indications that we have a Jewish image here? What is it about this that doesn't say to you, this is Christian? Now, so we have the Hebrew lettering, but we also have the symbol of the synagogue. And the traditional Jewish hat on the male figure, the individual on the left. You can see that really different. It's not perhaps a type of hat that you're accustomed to seeing. And so the bride is over on the right. Now, why do you think the female figure is blindfolded? So something to think about is that perhaps the blindfold is representing this idea of blind faith. The woman will follow God and his teachings without question. That's one way to look at it, and that's how scholars have interpreted that. All right, so most of you have probably heard of the Inquisition. It's a fairly popular topic when it comes to studying the Middle Ages. The council, the Fourth Lateran Council, really challenged religious and secular authorities to put down heresy. Again, there was a hardening during this time regarding heretics. The Inquisition was originally set up in the wake of the crusade against Albigensianism in southern France. Remember, we talked about the Albigensian crusade last week. And the Inquisition actually became permanent in 1233. So it was no longer convened to deal with specific situations. It was ongoing and it was permanent. Now, aided by secular authorities, the church-appointed inquisitors now called those suspected of heresy to testify, sometimes nearly entire villages. Inquisitions usually began with a preaching. This was where individuals suspected of heresy were questioned, and then clemency was promised to those who confessed. So you have this pattern of Inquisition. You have public preaching followed by the questioning of individuals under suspicion, and then those who confessed were promised clemency. Those who quickly recanted or were unaware that their beliefs were heresies were usually given fairly lenient penalties, but those who refused to repent were viewed as threats to the salvation of others and punished severely. So think about it in this way. We have seen lots of examples in this course of societies that drew clear links to public duty and the preservation of the community. So you saw that the Romans, one of the reasons why they found Christianity to be so threatening was, had to do with Christians' refusal to sacrifice to the gods and to pay respects to Caesar, to the emperor. And so this was a disturbing thing for Romans because they perceived that as an unwillingness to do their duty and possibly threatening the prosperity and security of the community as a result. The idea is that if you don't do this, then you're going to bring the judgment of the gods down upon us. And so we can kind of see that this idea is still holding sway in Europe. So this helps explain why rooting out heresy was so very important to some Christians, and why the failure to confess was seen as a continuing threat to the community, and as a result of a failure to confess, victims were sometimes brutally punished as a result. Now, during the 13th century, long-term imprisonment became a tool for repressing heresy. This is interesting because we haven't seen really, prior to this time period, a need for long-term imprisonment. Punishments for crimes were usually dealt with fairly quickly at the local level. But now we see this need to hold people prisoner for a long time. And often these people were tortured. And we have long-term imprisonment even if a heretic confessed. And the long-term imprisonment became a tool for further interrogation concerning other supposed heretics and heretic plots. So you hold somebody in a prison, and you can continue to question them and continue to identify heretics that are out there in the world. So this is really a little bit of a paranoid view in terms of, wanting to just kind of ferret out anybody and everybody who might possibly be a heretic. This was the idea. And so long-term imprisonment becomes a tool for that. Now, the number of preaching friars in towns also increased. Some of them were actually university trained. There was a real effort on the church to educate churchmen. And so we can kind of see that this notion of an educated priest is spreading throughout Europe. It's becoming more common for there to be educated preachers. And so we have friars who are focused on applying Christian teaching to ordinary life, and they're really influential in many parts of Europe. Some lay people became tertiary friars, where they engaged in works of prayer and piety in imitation of the friars. So they didn't quite go as far as taking the same vows that the friars did, but they often did a lot of the same things that friars did. There was an explosion of female piety in this era. Many new nunneries were founded. If you'll recall, oftentimes, if a family had daughters, one of the avenues through which, if you couldn't find a suitable husband, one of your possible avenues for finding a place for your daughter was to place her in a nunnery. And so nunneries became, and we're going to see this continue through the Renaissance, that nunneries became a way of families to sort of just kind of, find a place for their daughters. And many nunneries were very divided along class. And so if you were of a particular family, of a particular status, you might choose a particular nunnery, if that makes sense. Now, with this explosion, not only do we get new nunneries, but we also get a lot of female mystics. Female mystics proliferated during this time period. A lot of women joined mendicant orders, and domestic piety intensified for many as well, particularly in urban areas. Some women were so dedicated to the Eucharist that they ate little else. Imagine that. That was their sole sustenance for the most part. In this way, women used their control over ordinary food to gain social and religious power. Kind of an interesting development. The situation for Jews became abnormally intense. It became really tense in this era as Christian monarchs gained power and piety intensified. Oftentimes when you see these periods of intense piety, if things do go wrong, you look for a scapegoat. And so we see a lot of scapegoating of Jews during this time period. And we see that as the Inquisition is becoming more and more prevalent, that there's this response, this anti-Semitic response that results. Jews moved to the cities, but they were often excluded from guild activities. And think about that, because that means that Jewish populations were largely cut off from the economic activities and the economic life of an urban area. Many were compelled to become moneylenders because other fields were closed to them. Kings in England and France imposed special taxes on Jews and confiscated their property. Lesser lords and monarchs alike capitalized on popular anti-Jewish sentiment to enrich themselves or even rid themselves of debt. So it's really interesting because we've got many Jews relegated to a certain occupation, money lending. And as a result of that, Jews hold a lot of debt. If you recall, in Christianity, usury was illegal. You couldn't charge interest. And so if you needed money, if you needed a loan, your option was to go to a Jewish moneylender. And so as a result of Jewish populations being forced into this occupation, they held a lot of debt. This increased resentment, and you can see where this is going. So it's really kind of unfortunate because we see Jewish populations in a particular situation because of growing suspicion, growing mistrust, and that attitude towards Jews are being reinforced by what they were relegated to. I hope that makes sense. So it's kind of a vicious cycle. It's self-perpetuating. It's really unfortunate. Let's see. One of the things that we see happening in this time period is we see a lot of publication of really sensational stories. So think about some of those magazines that you'll sometimes see on the racks in the grocery store. This would be kind of like that. These would be really, really sensationalized stories. And oftentimes, these sensationalized stories looked very similar. They oftentimes told of Jews sacrificing Christian children, or perhaps disrespecting the Eucharist. And these circulated widely. And in normal good times, they might be just sort of, ignored or chuckled at or whatever. But if times were bad, these could be dangerous. They could instigate hatred. And so in some areas, Jews were actually forcefully expelled or even massacred. So, for example, all Jews were expelled from England in 1291. And this is going to continue for some time. We're going to see in 1492 that there was an expulsion of Jews from Spain. that contributed to a really serious brain drain for Spain. And some scholars have hypothesized that it was so severe that Spain is still struggling with the repercussions of that. They weren't really able to recover from that expulsion and what it meant culturally for them, what it meant for their basis of knowledge. Now, we also have lepers. Lepers increasingly became objects of both charity and disgust. It's really kind of, it's sort of this two sides of the same coin situation, really, really bizarre. So you have people who are sick with leprosy, and this ideal of Christian charity requires people to take care of the sick. But at the same time, because of the nature of the disease, people in general felt a lot of fear. They felt a lot of disgust about this disease. And so if you happen to have leprosy, life was pretty difficult for you. Because of their contagious and disfiguring disease, lepers were forced to live outside of society in special isolated houses that were set up for charitable reasons and for segregating the population of lepers. Lepers also had to worship in their own churches. They weren't allowed to worship with other Christians. Okay, so we have a map I want to show you. This is a map of some of the blood libel charges that were made in Europe between the years of 1100 and 1300. These were kind of the areas around which these blood libel charges centered. Blood libel is what I talked about just a few seconds ago, in that, you know, some Christians believed that Jews had this practice of sacrificing young children in order to sort of harvest their blood for rituals, for religious rituals. And it incited a lot of fear among Christians. And it also became a way of sort of explaining when things went wrong, what was going on. So what it did was gave Christians an excuse for scapegoating Jewish populations when things were going poorly, when there was a lot of sickness, or when there was a lot of war, when violence was running rampant. You know, you wanted to find an explanation for this. So people would point their finger at Jews and say, well, it's their fault because this is what they're doing. They're sacrificing our children. And so we have some cases that occurred throughout Europe in which, you know, maybe a child would disappear, and the immediate conclusion that people jumped to is that, oh, he must have been kidnapped by the Jewish people in town. Let's go string him up. And so really kind of scary. This is a scary time. If you didn't happen to be Christian, this was a scary time for you. And so you can see from this map some of the places where these charges of blood libel occurred throughout Europe, and you can see that there's some down in Spain. We have various years down in Spain in Saragossa. Then we have places in France, and we have places in the Holy Roman Empire, and even up in England. Even though, and England, remember, is expelling their Jews, and so this is kind of fueling this anti-Jewish fervor. Now, Scholasticism is an important development in the history of Europe, in the history of the West. Scholasticism is this idea that you use logical inquiry in an attempt to summarize and reconcile all knowledge. Scholastics in the universities, they were very influential on the development of university educations during this time period. They were confident that knowledge from the senses and reason was compatible with knowledge obtained through faith and revelation. So we can see that this is an effort to reconcile science with faith, science and religion, to bring those two together, to bring these two ways of developing knowledge together to get a greater understanding of the world and the way that it works. And so Scholasticism as a movement is very fascinating, because today in the modern era we often think of science and religion as being really incompatible, or at least separate, that they don't function well together. But Europeans did not think this way. This is a very modern notion that science and religion are two separate things, and never the twain shall meet. We can see that Europeans did not agree with that. That's not something that that would have resonated with them. Now, the method of scholasticism, the methods that they used, made confident use of Aristotle's rules of logic and often investigated the natural world. So if you recall, Aristotle was all about observation. He was all about empiricism. And so scholastics are they're being heavily influenced by Aristotle. They're taking his methodology and they're applying it in new and interesting ways. An example of scholasticism is, of course, Thomas Aquinas. He lived in the 13th century. He was the most famous scholastic. He was a Neapolitan Dominican, so he belonged to the Dominican order, and he was from Naples, in Italy, Napoli, if you're Italian. He was a master at the University of Paris. We talked about the University of Bologna earlier, and Innocent III's education there. Well, now we have St. Thomas Aquinas. He was educated at the University of Paris, another prestigious university. He published the monumental Summa Theologica in 1273, and his intention was to cover all important topics, hence the use of the word summa in the title. The topics were divided into questions, many of which spoke to practical concerns of the day, such as whether or not it was lawful to sell something for more than it was worth. Scholasticism was enormously optimistic, and it offered a sense of purpose and order and a guide to behavior. However, scholasticism did not always provide unity, and later scholastics, such as John Duns Scotus, he was a Franciscan who taught at Oxford and Paris. Scholastics like Scotus concerned themselves with the limits of reason. Duns Scotus found the world and God to be less compatible. He believed illumination came not as a matter of course, but only when God chose to intervene. Okay. Dante Alighieri, you are probably familiar with him. His poetry harmonized the scholastic universe with the mysteries of faith and the poetry of love. He was very influential. In Italian, it's known as the Divina Commedia. We know it as the Divine Comedy. It described an imaginary journey through hell and purgatory to paradise. It was an allegory. It was an allegorical poem. So it had a lot of imagery, a lot of meaning embedded into it, and a lot of representational imagery as well. The popularity of the poem influenced the development of the Italian language, interestingly enough. It's one of those works of literature that had a lot to do with standardization of the Italian language. And other writers were so heavily influenced they addressed similar themes. In essence, the Divine Comedy explored the soul's search for meaning, for enlightenment, and for divine love. And these were important themes to Europeans of the day. Musicians, too, developed new forms that bridged the secular and the sacred. Freer melodies led to harmony. We see a higher emphasis on harmonics in music. Motet music began in France, probably Paris, and often used 2 or 3 lines of melody, sometimes sung by instruments. Instruments were used to kind of mimic the human voice, I guess you could say. Motets were written for and by clerical elites, but they were made use of but they also made use of the music of ordinary people. So you see this really flexible ways in which this music was used. New notation of rhythm helped composers indicate rhythm and notes more precisely. So we see even just the development of our modern musical system, modern musical composition, and the standardization of that. We've talked about Gothic art in earlier weeks. Gothic architecture began around 1135, if you'll recall, with the remodeling of the Church of Saint-Denis, and it spread from France throughout Europe. Gothic church architecture allowed for large windows, and chemically treated colored glass with lead and painted images was used to depict complicated religious scenes. And these were becoming intensely popular throughout Europe and were becoming a way for elites to sort of give back to the community. And, you know, if you had a lot of money, you could pay for these really magnificent stained glass windows to be put into these churches and cathedrals. It was your way of kind of giving back to the community and helping to bring people to God. And so stained glass was seen as a heavenly art. Gothic cathedrals were also decorated with sculpture. Sculpted in the round, Gothic figures moved and interacted with one another, often to tell a religious story or express a spiritual truth. This was a very popular theme. And theme sculptures were used to sum up a body of truths. So we have Scholasticism, and then we also have this development in the arts that is reflecting some of these changes in the way that people are thinking about the world. Gothic sculpture spread from France throughout the 13th century with regional variations. In painting, Giotto, who lived between 1266 and 1337, so into the 14th century, Giotto experimented with the illusion of depth. Now think about this. What would the Renaissance have looked like if we don't have experimentations with depth, with providing this illusion that art is three-dimensional? It makes you stop and think a little bit, doesn't it? His figures expressed a range of emotion. These were very emotional pieces of art. He blended religious meaning with human forms often, and Giotto found another way to bring together the natural and divine realms. Gothic style also appeared in paintings as a decorative motif, and manuscript illuminations featured stained glass windows as background themes. So just kind of interesting to see how all of these different art forms, literary forms, scholasticism is all kind of working together to change culture. All right, so moving on to politics, the papacy and the German emperors continued to struggle for control of Italy, which was symbolically significant and offered a rich source of income. Barbarossa's son married Constance, an heiress of Sicily, but he died before he could use his position in southern Italy to expand his power. During his son Frederick II's childhood, the German princes and the papacy attempted to control the imperial office. Pope Innocent III crowned Otto of Brunswick emperor in exchange for his promise not to invade Italy, a promise, of course, that was soon broken. Otto invaded Sicily in 1211, and the Pope excommunicated him. In 1212, Innocent gave the crown to Frederick II. Frederick was heir to Sicilian and German culture. Remember, his mother was Sicilian, and his father was German, and so he kind of straddled both those worlds. Innocent's papacy was expansionistic and determined to strengthen its claim to the Italian papal states and resist any German expansion into Italy. And this is going to bring, we're going to see that this is going to bring the papacy into conflict with the German emperors. Now, Frederick sought to control Italy with a three-pronged approach that involved strengthening his hold over Sicily, so Sicily was important to him, making concessions to the German princes, because of course he needed their support in order to succeed, and expanding his control of Italy by entering through Lombardy. 4 popes after Innocent resisted Frederick's efforts and excommunicated him on several occasions, including most seriously at the Council of Lyon in 1245. They also preached a crusade against him, which lasted until his death in 1250. Now, the concessions that Frederick made to the German princes allowed them to turn their regions into virtually independent states and left German regions divided until the 19th century. Frederick's failure strengthened the position of the German princes and in 1273 brought the Swabian Habsburg family to imperial power as the Holy Roman Emperors. This was a prestigious but meaningless honorific. Frederick's failure in Italy meant that these Italian cities would continue to be divided. Sicily was ruled by a succession of other families. It was eventually claimed by both the kings of Aragon and the House of Anjou in modern France. While the popes resisted losing control of Italy, they came under attack for using religion as a political tool. So lots of consequences for the weakening of the German Empire and its emperor in terms of the sort of the political makeup of Germany as well as of the papacy. And I'm sure that Frederick II didn't anticipate this. So just to give you an idea of what Italy looked like at the end of the 13th century, here's a map. And you can see there's not really a key there, but what you can see in the dark green, these would be the papal states that the papacy was continuing to exert control over, and hoping to expand influence over, beginning with Innocent III. And then we have the Kingdom of Naples down in the south. This, like I said, this would be Napoli if you're Italian. Sicily, of course, is where the boot is aiming. And then up in the hashed green, these would be areas that were claimed by the papacy that often served as a focus for conflict between the Germans and the papacy. So just keep that in mind. All right, Louis IX. Louis IX reigned from 1226 to 1270. He established a new ideal of kingship. And it's kind of funny because it seems like when you study European history that this is what you see happening oftentimes with the French, is they reinvent the monarchy. He was revered as a military leader, but also primarily as an administrator, judge, and a so-called just father of his people. This was the perception of him, the image that he conveyed, and so he was fairly popular. Louis used salaried magistrates to expand the influence of royal courts. He was a zealous crusader. Louis resisted territorial conflicts at home. He respected the church and the Pope in spiritual matters, but he also protected his own royal authority, particularly in matters of excommunication. He hated Jews. And some of the ways that we see him expressing that is he canceled debts owed to them, and he ordered them to leave France or live by the labor of their hands in 1253. This was his declaration: you must live by the labor of your hands. Many of his contemporaries considered him to be a saint because of his concern for the poor and sick and his personal piety, and he was actually canonized in 1297. Louis increased the power and the prestige of the French monarchy. So in Germany we see a decline, but in France we see a continuing. We see the monarchy on this track of continuing prestige. Okay, so just gives you an idea. This map just gives you an idea of the layout of France under Louis IX, what it looked like. It probably doesn't really look very much like what you're accustomed to seeing when you look at a map of France, but some of the regions are there, and we're beginning to see it coalescing around the French monarchy. And the French monarchy controlled this area in the center called Ile-de-France. You can see it's labeled in parentheses with the royal domain. This was where the monarchs ruled from and exerted influence. And so you can kind of see that it's even just geographically is set up so that the rest of these French provinces are revolving around it. And so, like I said, some of these areas to the right, to the east, are going to come under French influence eventually. Burgundy, for example. All right. Rulers sought to enlist broad support for their policies from the two most powerful orders of medieval society. These would be the nobility and the clergy. Those who work and those who pray and those who fight. Across Europe, rulers summoned parliaments, and as townsmen became more important, they became more closely integrated into royal government. One of the earliest were the Cortes of Castile-Leon. This was in what we know of today as modern Spain. The Cortes were representative assemblies that included townsmen. Once they were convened at court, the townsmen joined bishops and noblemen in formally counseling the king and assenting to royal decisions. So they're giving their approval. Alfonso IX summoned them in the first year of his reign and then called on them regularly to participate in major political and military decisions and to assent to taxes. In the 12th century, the English King Henry II had consulted with prelates and barons at great councils, and these were sort of the beginnings of what we think of as parliament. He used these parliaments as tools to ratify and gain support for his policies. During the first 16 years of the reign of young Henry III, England was governed by a council of a few barons, university-trained administrators, and a papal legate. In 1258, the barons, who were unhappy over Henry III's wars and debts, threatened rebellion and forced a council of 15 on the king. When another civil war was won by Simon de Montfort, he attempted to consolidate his control over the king by convening a parliament and including, along with earls, barons, and churchmen, representatives from the towns, the commons, so to speak. Now, kings gradually gained power relative to the papacy. We see this happening. Popes attempted to exempt clergy from taxation and keep them subject only to ecclesiastical courts. But by the end of the 13th century, monarchs challenged these privileges. Philip the Fair of France and Edward I both financed wars by taxing clergy. Pope Boniface VII, insisted that only the Pope could tax clerics and ordered the clergy to disobey the royal orders. So you can kind of see where this is going. Edward threatened to declare resisting clergy outlaws. So he threatened to declare them outside the law in terms of their choices, I'm sorry, just trying to think of the word here, but they're undermining the law, so to speak. So they're doing this by disobeying royal orders. And so Philip forbade the export of all metals, money, or jewels, and this forced Boniface to back down and concede the right to tax in 1297. So you can see that between some of these monarchs, like Philip the Fair of France and Edward I, that there's the struggle going on between the monarchs and the papacy, and this is going to change the relationship between the so-called state and the church. Now, when Philip the Fair arrested a bishop on a charge of treason in 1301, another confrontation with Boniface began, with Philip deriding and humiliating the Pope and calling a French assembly. The French assembly was known as the Estates General, and he did this he convened them to support his policies. When the Pope issued a defiant bull, if you remember, a bull is sort of a declaration, a papal declaration. The king accused him of various crimes and heresies. Now, Philip's agents invaded the papal palace at Avignon and attempted to capture the Pope, but local people actually resisted. Boniface died shortly after, but the next popes actually pardoned Philip. The humiliation of the popes weakened the institution's influence over monarchs and even its own churchmen, and the balance between church and state broke down. In 1309, the Pope fled civil disorder in Rome, so even in his home territory there was a lot of instability as a result of this conflict, and he settled in Avignon, where the popes remained until 1378. Many Europeans were concerned about the Avignon popes, many of whom were French, and they saw the Pope's absence from Rome as a calamity, so there was a real decline in the prestige of the papacy during this time. The Avignon organization was actually pretty efficient, and regular revenues gave the papacy more influence over church appointments than they had had before, even as they slowly abandoned the idea of leading all Christendom. So if you take a look at this portrait of a pope, I want you to think about something. Why would the artist emphasize this pope's seriousness at this particular time. And this pope is Anicetus. And so why the emphasis on how serious this pope is? So something to think about is that during this time, there were threats to the power of the papacy from secular leaders. Pope Nicholas III wanted to assert the church's supremacy, and a historical depiction of solemnity in art was one way to do so. Now, how does Anicetus's dress reinforce the idea that art can communicate power and authority? What's going on with his sort of uniform, if that's what you want to call it? Now, the portrait shows the ancient pope wearing what's called a pallium. This symbolized papal power. And this would not have existed in the first century. This is a new development. This is not something that existed in the early days of the church. However, the garment was familiar to audiences of this time and would have been used to clearly indicate the identity and importance of the subject. So if you saw this piece of art, you would know immediately who it was. During the 13th century, within the Italian communes, non-noble groups called the Popolo struggled to gain influence. The Popolo were armed and militant, and they attempted to form alternate centers of power to the nobility, particularly seeking a role in determining tax policies. In some cities, nobles overcame and dissolved the Popolo, while in others, the Popolo squeezed the nobles out of the government. Now, regional nobles were able to take advantage of the unrest within communes to increase their own power and influence. They often established themselves as Signori. Signori means lords. And they established themselves as Signori or lords of the cities. Typically, Signori kept the peace at the price of repression. So these were not kindly rulers. Now, moving over to Eastern Europe, from the 1230s, the Mongols attacked Russia, Poland, and Hungary, where regional princes were weak. There was a bit of a power vacuum there, and the Mongols took advantage of that. They also attacked Germany, and in 1250 they conquered Iran and Iraq. And of course, at this time, Iraq is a modern construct, just so you're aware. But this would be the area that we're talking about. Their sophisticated military tactics, these would be the military tactics of the Mongols. Their military tactics involved multi-pronged invasion and mobility. And this made them really tough adversaries. They were really tough to beat. They were most successful in Russia. They captured Kiev in 1240 and dominated Russia's principalities for 2 centuries. Really long-lasting. Russian princes paid tribute to the Mongol Khan, and the Russian church was tolerated. The Mongol conquest opened China to Europeans for the first time. So if you'll recall, a lot of trade that was going on with the East was often happening with Muslim populations as intermediaries, as go-betweens. But now we have trade going on directly between China and Europeans. And how we see that happening is that we have Europeans going to China for the first time as missionaries, diplomats, and merchants. And they traveled there over land or sea. So there were several options that you could take to travel to China. The most famous European you're probably familiar with, especially if you've ever swam in a swimming pool, Marco Polo, 1254 to 1324. He was a merchant from Venice, and he was the most famous of these Europeans to go to China. He's most famous because he wrote extensively about his travels, and they still are a really terrific source of information from the time period. But we have others who went as well. He wasn't the only one. And there is some evidence as well that even entire communities went there. The Pope sent the Franciscan missionary John of Monte Corvino as his envoy to China, sort of his ambassador. In general, contact with the Mongols opened up new land routes to the east and helped bind together east and west. And one of the primary ways that binding occurred was through trade, through the exchange of goods and money. All right, so just so you can see what this kind of looked like, you know, we kind of have this perception that these are very different continents and they're separated by lots of water, but you can see from this map, if you look in that upper left corner, you can see parts of Eastern Europe, and you can even see Italy, the little tiny boot there kicking the island of Sicily. So really, this is a large landmass, and it is connected by land. So, you know, we've constructed this idea of continents, but they're very much a construct. But from this map, you can see how expansive the Mongol Empire was before 1259. It's really, you know, we talk about the Roman Empire in this class, and we talk about the Persian Empire, and when you see the territories, the massive amounts of territory that the Mongols were able to grab and control for quite some time, it's really, really remarkable. But of course, you know, the Mongols, they could be quite brutal to live under. Or at least if you were living in an area where they were expanding into, it could be a fearful experience. All right, in 1315 through 1322, we have what historians call the Great Famine. This Great Famine left many weak and sick and strengthened social divisions. Some of the reasons, there's been quite a bit of study on the Great Famine and why it occurred. And what we have is this period in which there were heavy rains, and those heavy rains made it really difficult to grow crops. You have to have some dry weather. You know, on the face of it, it seems like water is a good thing, but when you have too much water, you can't have good crops. Too much water lessens productivity, and it also, in the long run, makes it really difficult to be able to harvest. Leads to problems like mold and fungus, and you know, there's just a lot of problems with having heavy rains. And on top of that, there was a rampant death of farm animals during this time, and this led to increased prices on food. So we have grain crops and vegetables and all of these other things, but we also have meat. Meat is becoming more expensive. And as a result of this inflation on food prices, we get rampant suffering and death. This isn't even the Black Plague yet. Peasants and the poor were most at risk, while monasteries' lords and the well-to-do peasants really benefited from high prices. And that tends to be what happens. Vulnerable people suffer. Those who already have money tend to do just fine and even better, because they're getting more money for the goods that they're selling. Rural and urban areas lost 5 to 10% of their population. That's pretty significant. It's not Black Plague significant, but this is pretty significant loss of life. Charities offered relief, and many prayed for deliverance during this time. There was a resurgence of piety. People were really fearful. Monarchs tried to control prices, and some peasants migrated in search of better land and weather. This isn't the only time that we're going to see this. Think about the Great Depression in our own country and the impact that it had on migrating populations, people moving around in search of better jobs, better weather. Towns became important because towns provided charitable relief. If you were poor and you had no options, you could go to a town and be fed by a monastery or some other charitable group. Population growth contributed to the difficulty in producing enough food. Remember, we've had the agricultural revolution, and this has changed the way that food is produced. It's expanded the amount of food that is produced as well, expanded the amount of land in production, and this led to a lot of population growth. But by 1300, exponential population growth had entirely halted. But there were no technological advances that now aided agricultural productivity. So we have large population growth, but no corresponding innovation in agricultural techniques. So this is contributing to the difficulties that people were facing. On top of that, wars between rulers and the associated destruction of crops in the countryside pushed some localities over the edge. We see failures of villages. High taxes and grain requisitions also exacerbated the famine. In some places, peasants revolted, and the limits of authority were made clear. Okay, this is a great piece. I really love it. We see some beautiful color, beautiful imagery in here, even though it is really a rather disturbing image. So when you look at this image, you can see elements of religious belief, but you can also see fears of religious damnation. For example, there's a demon at the top, and that demon may be a sign of the famine as a punishment for human actions. That often was sort of the purpose of the demon, the depiction of the demon in artwork. And we're really going to see this during the period of the Black Plague, that artwork that centers on demons and skeletons, it really gets macabre and really dark. The artwork does. Now, the religious figures at the far right and the woman praying on the far left indicates that faith was omnipresent in people's lives and in art. So, really interesting. If you want to zoom into this image, you can, just to take a closer look and see what else you can see in there. It's really a fascinating piece. Now, this depiction sort of represents the chaos and fear that people were feeling during the famine. You can see that it is a very chaotic image. There's a lot of tumult. There's a lot of movement in this picture. And this, if I didn't mention it before, this is a marketplace, and you can see that it's just really kind of a chaotic market. And you can see that there are soldiers. If you look closely, you can see spears. And these would be the soldiers, and you see this idea being conveyed that soldiers are necessary to keep order because life is chaotic and life is tenuous. Now, on the far left side, you can also see the mother. You can see a mother with her two children praying. So those are kind of the interesting parts that I see. But like I said, if you want to take a closer look, maybe you can see more. And just a final map. I usually like to end with a map. And so around 1340, here's what Europe looked like.